Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in on a Friday afternoon. The first Friday in October for a home football game is about as quintessential Notre Dame as you can get. So thank you for taking some time away from that awful 75-degree cloudless sky weather we have outside. But it's a pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to introduce my colleague to you. My name is Ernest Morale. I'm the Associate Dean for the Humanities in the College of Arts and Letters. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third event in a series we call Ahead of the Game, which is a football lecture series sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters. So over the course of the season, I think we have about 7 or 8 of them. We are from faculty members all over the college, and these are our most productive, our most fascinating colleagues, no pressure, Dr. Köll, who we invite just to give you a glimpse of the genius that folks like myself get to be a part of every day. They tell us about the research, and they do it in ways that are accessible and engaging. So we're delighted to have you here today. If you're back for the USC game, October 22nd is our next Ahead of the Game, and Donna Forston from the Department of Film, Theater, and Television will be speaking, and she's also an amazing scholar. It'll be the same time, 2:30, 3 weeks from today. I'd like to thank our colleagues for having us here in this beautiful recital hall. I don't get over to this part of campus too much, but it's an amazing addition to the university to have it here. So I would like to thank our colleagues in the Department of Music, and especially the Sacred Music Program, for allowing us to be here. We're especially grateful to Peter Jeffrey, Margot Fassler, Janet Day Six, Matt Payden, and Daniel Stein. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues in the Dean's Office in Arts and Letters who've been amazingly helpful in this series. Our student assistant, Emily Hannon, Chloe Leach, one of our senior administrative coordinators in the college, who works very closely with the speakers. So thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Emily. Another colleague here, Michelle, who works from the Dean's Office. Thank you, Michelle, for being here. And many, many others behind the scenes who helped to make this happen. But our speaker today is a great colleague of mine, Professor Elisabeth Köll. As you can see, she's one of our chairs. She is the William Payden Collegiate Chair. She also holds another chair, being the chair of our history department at the University of Notre Dame. She received her PhD in Chinese business history from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Her most recently published book, Railroads and the Transformation of China, which came out with Harvard University Press in 2019, we just heard, it's been translated and published in China, uses the Chinese railroad system as a prism to explore the development of railroads as business and administrative institutions in China from the late 19th century to the 1980s. Professor Köll's study addresses questions of how and to what extent railroads affect China's development throughout the 20th century, and conversely, how China's development shaped the railroad itself as a bureaucratic and economic system. What we'll hear today is Professor Köll's most recent project. It's tentatively titled An American Salesman in China, Business and Society in the Globalizing Economy of the 1920s, based on the fascinating archival records of a former sales agent for the British American Tobacco Company in North China. This study explores China's business environment prior to World War II and discusses the opportunities, challenges, and competition from the perspective of Chinese and Western firms. Today's talk is a glimpse of that work. So hot off the not yet presses work from Professor Köll. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elisabeth Köll.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, thank you, Professor Morale, for this most generous introduction. I'm grateful to the Dean's Office for inviting me to give this talk in the first place. I'm really honored. And I want to use this opportunity also as a shout out to Joan Payden and her family, who have so generously supported my research over the years. Well, as Ernest indicated, I'm very fortunate to work in the history department with a number of colleagues who all have interest and do research on topics that are right at the intersection of economy and society. We also have a teaching angle to that. 2 years ago, we started a minor in economic and business history for our undergraduates. And what I want today is to show you what kind of work business and economic historians do, how we approach and deal with archival sources, and what kind of objectives we have in terms of telling the stories and the arguments, how they matter for interpreting the past and the present. Here in particular, I would also like to acknowledge the tremendous help that I've gotten from the Harvard Yenjing Special Collections librarians. The talk today has to do and focuses on the world and the work of Frank Canaday in China in the 1920s. And his papers are housed, at least I should say the papers on the China years are housed in the Harvard Yenjing Library. And because this is COVID time and we can't go and move around Asia as it is usual for people who work on China, this is now a really great opportunity to make use of the thousands of letters and photographs that he took while he worked for British American Tobacco from 1922 to 1926 in China. And so we begin our journey, and the question is, who is Frank Canaday? This is the man, in some ways, a local person. He was born in Newcastle, Indiana, in 1893, and and you will see this in the course of this presentation, is quite on the one hand, normal person in terms of having a real job and moving around the world with all kinds of professional assignments. But at the same time also, he had a real artistic talent. He wrote very well, he drew very well. He was somebody who, in many ways, never really found his place. He was incredibly curious and a really keen and thoughtful observer, almost like an anthropologist. Canaday went to Harvard on a scholarship. He graduated with a BA in English literature, shout out for the humanities, in 1914. And after his graduation, he first took on a couple of positions with advertising companies. I should say that his older brother, Ward, had an advertising company, so there is a family relationship. And then in 1917, he actually signed up to join the army and served in France as a lieutenant from 1917 to 1919. But, and this is again, I think, a really interesting aspect, he's a translator for the headquarters, and so it indicates he has great language capability and is very flexible in getting used to new environments. So you see him here looking at us with a smile, and serenity. This picture was taken in early 1926. So let's just imagine how Canaday arrived in China in 1922. And the interesting thing is that there is a football angle, and I'm not making this up. So Canaday, after he came back from the war, worked for Roland K. Company in Chicago and then for the Guarantee Trust in New York. And he was restless. And then a friend asked him, a former classmate from Harvard, to take an eminent visitor to the Harvard-Yale football game. And guess what? That visitor was the head of Jungteiche, a subsidiary of British American Tobacco. And so he made that contact, and he was looking for a new challenge and opportunity. He applied to British American Tobacco, the New York office, went through the interview process, recommendations, et cetera, and then at the end of 1921, he gets on the ocean liner, crosses the Pacific, stops briefly in Japan, and in January 1922, he arrives in Shanghai. And this is pretty much what you would have seen at the time. I think it's important for us to understand that Shanghai at that time was really the most important commercial financial hub in, not just in China, but in East Asia. This is a view of the Bund you see here. This is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the China Maritime Customs, and various other representative offices. This is the Huangpu River docks. His liner would have docked a little bit outside for the big ships. But what this rather, well, don't want to say messy, but bustling and vibrant image conveys to you is that this was the hub not just for people coming in to Shanghai and China, but also connecting it to the interior, because Shanghai on the mouth of the Yangtze River, you have access to the river system, the canal system, and in many ways it was the place to be in the 1920s. This is the British American Tobacco headquarters in Shanghai, a very impressive modern building. And what I would like to say here, of course, this is where he started out, spent his first couple of weeks, and I can tell you, when you read his letters when he arrived in January, he was in the beginning pretty shocked. You know, in terms of hygiene, the population density, everything was pretty alien and felt quite unsettling. But on the other hand, there was a very settled foreign community in Shanghai. Shanghai was a treaty port, and what that meant is that what you saw in the previous image, and here all these buildings were part of the so-called international settlement, where you had different legal regulations and where the law of extraterritoriality gave special protections to foreign nations, their firms, etc., etc. So in some ways, you could say Shanghai was pretty modern and very developed at the time, but also Shanghai was not China. That is something that's always very important to point out, that you can have really developed pockets of urbanization and industrialization, and especially in the early 20th century, these places were the beacons of development, but didn't reflect how about 85% of the countryside was developed by comparison. I thought I'll show you this. So he had to go through some training in the beginning. And of course, he had to do all the paperwork for, now being a BAT man. And what I love about here is this paragraph. So you have to basically make a will before you sign on, and who, in case of death, would get your assets. And here he says, I desire my remains to be dealt with as follows. Buried in a convenient spot where the Chinese are not likely to run any subways through for a couple of centuries. And that is very prescient because, as you know, subway building and infrastructure building is, China's real achievement. And I think Canaday is spot on here and would probably be still surprised at the infrastructure development that he had, that has been taken place. So, although being a sales and advertising consultant was not a per se dangerous occupation, Canaday was charged with being the liaison person for Yongtai, which was a subsidiary of British American Tobacco. BAT owned 51%. And he was charged with supervising the promotion of the Ruby Queen cigarette. You will see that in a little while, especially in rural China. And before we, seek some truth from facts here, let me just give you some brief idea of what we are dealing with China in 1911. So this is the Republic, founded in 1911. By the time Canaday arrives, 1922, there have been inroads made, no doubt, in terms of educational reforms, legal reforms. Industrialization is slowly taking off in the big centers, but at the same time, the political system is still very weak and fragmented. So there are intense struggle between the old capital, Beijing, and new political leaders in Nanjing. You see, so this is Shanghai, just to orient yourself. And the political fragmentation means that we have the emergence of not just political factions, but also serious warlordism that separates whole regions from each other in the north and the south. And it is an overall young, pretty unstable republic until 1927. And I will show you how this impacts the business of BAT, but also of all Chinese entrepreneurs and firms at the time. So the area that you will see in the following photos are mostly what we would now call, this is the Shandong province and Hubei, which is basically northern China, so Tianjin, Beijing, all this area, certainly not the most prosperous one and difficult to travel with, and certainly not something that somebody who just wants to sort of hang out with the expat community in Shanghai would be really keen on. But Canaday is a different case. So let's look at how he went about his work. So his work started out with shorter trips, sort of in the vicinity near Shanghai, up the Yangtze River. But very soon it was recognized by the headquarters because he was creative, he was flexible, and he had real entrepreneurial and adventurous spirit. He was the person who would go on the North China trips to basically observe and check out the Chinese distributor system, their whole sales network, the point of sales, and he would do a lot of commercial intelligence in terms of checking what the prices are of local Chinese cigarettes vis-a-vis BAT and Yongtai cigarettes. And they would do this in very backbreaking and long trips. What you see here is moving along the Shandong countryside on carts with donkeys. In case you wonder, in 1937, and this is because we have some data here, China had about 40,000 miles of motor road in the whole country, and about 40,000 motor cars, and a third of those were all in the Shanghai settlement. So this is just an indication to what extent we're still relying on traditional transportation methods. You can imagine how difficult it is when it rains or snows and these roads become muddy. It's almost impossible to pass. Sometimes they would have a car with them. In this case, a very high up boss came sort of on a short visit. This is near Shanghai, to sort of do a field trip with the distributors. And what is quite interesting is that Canaday reports that this was quite a nuisance because they got held up so often by people who just wanted to, watch and inspect the car and sort of have their photograph taken with them. So this was in some ways not a real benefit for doing these commercial inspection tours. This is not a very clear photograph, but it hints at the most important transportation facility, and that is the Canal System. So this is a part of the Canal System leading into the Grand Canal at the border between Shandong and Hebei, and this remained the choice for bulk shipment at the time because, yes, we did have some railroads in the 1920s, but they all went straight on the Eastern Corridor, and there were no real there wasn't a feeder network, so to speak. And in terms of cost, until the end of World War II, and actually even after 1949, water transportation for bulk was the most cost-effective way for transporting goods at the time, unless you were a big soybean or other commodity trader with special contracts on particular lines. And this would be an example of the people Canaday would visit. Here he says our dealer and his assistants in front of their shop in Caoxian, Shandong. What they would do is Canaday would go with his team. They would visit all the dealers, distributors, asking them about how much, whether there were any problems with the cigarette supply chain, whether, how much taxes they were paying, how their own sales compared to those of competitor brands, et cetera, et cetera. And the longer Canada stays, the more he gets into actually really trying to understand how local society, especially in rural China, works at the time, and getting into this network of personal relationships that is quite remarkable for a foreign sales and marketing person at the time. But I'm sure you are interested to know, how did the selling of cigarettes actually go? And how, what did people do in reaction to these BAT people coming through their villages? So before I show you the rural images, I think most of us, when we hear cigarettes, 1920s China, we think of these urban, very professional and sophisticated posters that advertise cigarettes for the urban elites at the time in the treaty ports, and sort of educated, and certainly speaking to also Western concepts of beauty. Here, for example, I think it's quite interesting that the lady wears a wristwatch, sort of modernity, including the hairstyle. I should say that in terms of smoking habits, men of all social classes smoked in China. We have sources that go back to the 14th, 15th century that give evidence of that. But of course, they did smoke differently. So farmers and laborers would mostly smoke tobacco in these long pipes. Snuff was very expensive, so that was an elite occupation. And cigarette smoking in the 1920s sort of became an advertising vehicle for modern sophistication, certainly speaking to a combination of certain traditional and Western concepts. You see often not just women, but even whole families sort of advertising the smoking gentleman supported by a good traditional family. So that makes it okay. But this is the city. This is not the countryside. And so Canaday has his work cut out. He and his collaborators were interested in expanding the sale of Ruby Queen. And you see here, this is actually in the suburbs of Tianjin City. The wall advertising is very to the point. It shows you the cigarette packet, and it gives you the price. And it is not anywhere near the elaborate sophistication that we see with the urban advertising posters. Canaday goes around with a camera, and in some ways, this is of course all for the job. People back, his bosses in Shanghai, are interested to know what is done with the advertising, how is it done. But I think what makes this so interesting for a historian is that we also see how Canaday moves around the countryside. So obviously here you see this is again a house wall painted with Ruby Queen, and this is the Chinese name of the cigarette. He just stands in the middle of the road and takes this picture. This one here is even more to the point. This is actually a competitor brand that he takes a photograph of. And as you can see here, he stands in the middle of the road with these people almost walking into his camera while he documents what the competition is up to. So that was certainly a big part of understanding what advertising was on display, and he sort of not very successfully tried to find out through conversations, through translators, sort of what people thought about this. What was even more interesting is how cigarettes would be sold and how this would play into BAT's and Ruby Queen's campaign. So here you see a very well-stocked tobacco vendor who sells Chinese and Western cigarettes. So this is a serious shop. Here on the side, these are all matches. And the match industry, tobacco and cotton, these were the sort of light industry textiles. These were the main staples of China's early industrialization. And so this would always then end up with long letters and prices per cigarette, per packet. He would interview these people to give intelligence back to the office. Now, in order to give you a real idea, this would be sort of the distributor at the lowest level. This gentleman sells fruit and sundries just on the street. He has it in 2 baskets and moves that around, and he sells cigarettes. And what he does is he doesn't even sell the packets, but individual cigarettes. That was the cheapest available way to smoke. And of course, these are the real examples of the most low-cost cigarettes that people who were workers, laborers, could afford. While doing all these observations, that was one part of Canaday's work. The other part was to bring new life to advertising campaigns. And this is quite an interesting example of his material, his advertising material being carried through the countryside for the purpose of organizing exhibition shows, campaigns, gramophone demonstrations, and handbills and giveaways. And so it is just, pulled by human labor through the fields to get from village to village. That was really hard work. Temple festivals, and I should say that Canaday really became more and more attuned to what worked and what didn't work in terms of the rural Chinese consumer at the time. He realized that temple festival and temple markets were the opportunity to gather and to capture a large audience. In China, in rural areas, we have the periodic market system, and that means, especially in combination with temple festivals, people attend the ceremonies, they go out and shop, they attend maybe an opera performance al fresco, they listen to musicians, they meet their friends, and of course this is the perfect place then to bring your product also to the consumer. And so here one of his Chinese assistants, they are organizing a parade with stilt walkers and all kinds of flags and giving out cigarettes as giveaways in the city of Caoxian where the festivities take place. And in the same way here, you have a photo, again, just taken in that moment, that shows people listening to a gramophone, which was a really big novelty in rural China in the 1920s. And so they listen to that, and they also begin to buy as in that promotion, cigarette packages, because there are prizes in there and you can win something as a bonus. So these are all the things they try out and find those engagements with the Chinese rural consumers much more fruitful than just relying on street advertising. Now, in terms of Mr. Canaday's interaction with the Chinese, and I went through the parts of the collection where I have photographs, and I wanted to show you something. There isn't that much where you really see a relaxed, natural interaction. A few times it's rather staged. And here, this is actually a good example of a Chinese farmer being pretty phased and not too excited when Mr. Canaday approaches and offers a cigarette. So I just wanted to show you this as an example of not being too. I will answer questions after the talk, so just keep it in mind, yeah? So this went on for a number of years, and now we come to the last chapter of Mr. Canaday's stay. So he increasingly stays away for months on these tours. I mean, BAT on the one hand is pretty happy to have such a flexible and patient salesperson and advertising person in the field. But he's also more and more disenchanted on the one hand about what he sees as a pretty disinterested foreign community in Shanghai that is, yes, very interested on going about their business and, going to the races on the weekend and being part of the amateur operatic society. But he finds that he cannot talk very meaningful to them about what's going on in China politically, and that there are a lot of things that are troubling to see in terms of social and political development. So one issue that we are, of course, dealing with is the information and how you get it at the time when you are in the field. So one of the wonders of this collection is that Canaday is the perfect newspaper clipper. He reads several newspapers, he keeps everything, and he keeps everything that people give him, from name cards to all kinds of receipts and bills. And by the time he's been in China for about 3 years, he actually takes half a year off and studies an intensive course in Beijing at the Union College Languages Institute to learn the language in speaking and to some extent in writing. But I told you at the beginning, China, the young republic, it's a messy place. So just keeping up with the basic and big picture movements of the military, etc., is quite difficult, and he tries his best to sort of educate himself. He reads anything that comes across in terms of news, and he also documents it with his camera. So, for example, here you have him taking a picture of the funeral procession for Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was the father of the Republic and died in 1925. And so Canaday was in Beijing at the time and went out to see the funeral procession. Here, this is actually the image of Sun Yat-sen and all these wreaths and contribution to document how different the funeral rites and practices are compared to what he was used at. Talk about somebody who is creative, inventive. This is a map that Canaday made for himself to point out and sketch out the different warlord factions. So here in the blue, these are the names of the provinces. But then he also pencils in the different warlord factions and the assumed direction of where they would move in the near future. This is the Peking Shanghai railroad line. And you see, I mean, it's pretty messy and crazy, and certainly reflects two things. There was no information out there at that level that, unless you were in sort of political intelligence, that you could get your hands on. And for him to be so aware of everything that's going on, that is really quite amazing. Now, if you thought that warlords and troop movements is bad, well, extractive payments are even worse, because these warlords were not just military leaders. Many of them held onto regions for many years, and so they would have their almost own pseudo-government and extract additional taxes, fees, to sponsor and fund their troops. And here he is hiding out with his colleague on a junk where they are bringing up cigarettes on the Yellow River. It's not that they are dodging real tax, they are dodging inofficial extortive tax. And if you thought it couldn't get worse, it can. So we're now by around 1926. This is an example of where they're bringing up or trying to bring up cigarettes on the Grand Canal in boxes, and the Grand Canal freezes in December. So they have to move the stuff from the boats to the railroads, but then they get robbed and plundered by warlord troops, which are not very well disciplined, as you can imagine. And it's not only the canal, they're moving it to the railroad. This is here in Baoding for moving whatever is left up north. But that became increasingly problematic too, because feuding warlords would blow up the very small existing rail system just without any consideration of public national economy. It was just to stop, the other enemy. And some warlords took over whole stations and made platforms their headquarters because they had a telephone. And what warlord doesn't want to have a telephone? So all these things became increasingly difficult, not just for Canaday, but also for Chinese firms. And by 1926, late 1926, doing business in the North became so difficult that Canaday decided that he wanted to leave his job with BAT and left China at the end of 1926. So, before we get to Q&A, let me just say a few things. So what does this all mean? I mean, apart from seeing how business is actually done in the countryside in the age of the first globalization, which, by the way, is a pretty big thing because we know how business at that time was done much more in terms of urban and industrial environments, but the countryside, that's a very different thing. So this is a great treasure trove of material to dive into. I think in terms of globalization, it shows us, this, the era of the first globalization brought new brands and Western business to China and triggered all the things that we are familiar with from, the current global circulation of brands, consumers, and financial networks. But I think also it shows the limits of globalization. I think from the perspective of Canaday, I think he saw how important the Chinese agents, distributors were, that business without them was impossible and that the success really depended on them. And it took BAT really quite a long time to acknowledge that. Sort of by the 1930s, we see a decrease in the foreign sales staff and a more and more focus increasing focus on the local sales representatives. And then finally, the last point would be that globalization is always complex. We see that in terms of indigenization, just because you begin to sell a foreign cigarette, it doesn't automatically mean that you are that you will be accustomed, that you will be successful. And I think a major sort of very practical issue is in terms of Chinese consumers in the countryside, price always wins. The price sensitivity of people, we see that throughout the years that Canaday makes these surveys. And that is something that anybody who does business in China certainly can relate you to today. And finally, I think that this is also a hint to look at concepts that people had of the China market. Carl Crow wrote this book in 1937, 400 million customers. And in some ways, this made a big splash, sort of some of the books we had with the opening of China and this, in the economic reforms in the 1990s. But I think that this, this analysis has shown that it is not that easy to really capture the hearts and minds and stay true to business. You have to be engaged and thoughtful about the social, economic, and cultural complexities at the time. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Yes, please.
Was there just the one manufacturing plant in the whole country, or do you know that?
For BAT, the manufacturing plant was in Shanghai, and that actually, they took that over from another firm. The name escapes me now, but the capacity was there about 250 million cigarettes a month, so this was a big operation.
And what about the brands? Were there a lot of competing Chinese brands?
Oh yeah. No, so I apologize. I didn't give you a full picture of the Chinese tobacco industry and the office. There were a lot of Chinese competitors. There were competitors like the Nanyang brothers. These were overseas Chinese who sort of had a big chunk of the market, but then also a lot of smaller Chinese firms which produced cigarettes at various price points and very often also very regionally targeted. So you could not buy every brand in every part of China. Absolutely, yeah.
the BAT tobacco, where did they grow the tobacco that they made the cigarettes out of?
Well, one of the major agricultural growth areas was Shandong, Hebei, and when the railway came, tobacco really became a major commercial crop to a point where BAT would equip railroad cars to do shows for farmers who wanted to get into, moving away from, I don't know, sweet potatoes or whatever, into tobacco leaf. And I think it's really important, if I may sort of say, the railroad for China really didn't do much for industrialization, but a lot for commercial agriculture. And so BAT would encourage and do contracts with farmers, to buy up whole crops. There were warehouses and whole new rail stations that served exclusively the transportation of the tobacco then on to Shanghai for further production. So that, made it a very lucrative arrangement for the company, but also for the farmers, who saw this as a much more reliable, steady income than what they had done before. Yeah, sure.
What percent of BAT's, tobacco worldwide? How much did China contribute to that?
Honestly, I can't, I can't answer you this, because also I think this is very depending on different years and segments. But certainly within China, Ruby Queen and BAT was really a market leader, but it was never a monopoly. And so that goes back to, your point that there were a lot of different brands. So you couldn't really monopolize the market. Yes, thank you. Yes, please.
I just wanted to make a comment in relation to that BAT questions in China. China is one of the toughest markets to crack for international tobacco companies. Mm-hmm. I know for a fact because I, used to work for Philip Morris. Same thing with BAT. China is the toughest one to crack. All kinds of regulations. They try to protect the domestic tobacco industry. So, from then till all the way now, I think we're talking about very, very little single-digit market share. Mm-hmm. It's almost impossible. You have to have maybe joint ventures or some sort of, cooperation with local tobacco company, like what they did back in 1920s. They owned a certain percentage of it. Chinese National Tobacco Corporation, right? So it's almost impossible to gain any traction. You have to build local brands. You have to do something else. You can't penetrate with your global brand in China.
Yeah, I think that's a really great comment. Thank you for that and for having an expert in the audience. That's really wonderful. And I would agree that the situation after 49, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, then fundamentally changed the game. BAT had to leave the country, like all Western business entities, and I completely agree with you, the regulation and protection of the brands really were very, very strict and made it really hard. If I may tell you a sort of a story here from my days, this is in the 1990s, when I did archival research, and at that time, you always had to bring, basically, you were bringing gifts, you know, to facilitate that you could make some photocopies and, you know, just as a gesture. And of course, there were a lot of Chinese cigarettes out there, and there are some premium brands everybody recognizes, like Red Flag and, you know, these kinds of things. But my go-to gift was a whole packet of Marlboro cigarettes at the time, because that was a sort of, it was almost like a currency that was recognized as, you know, a Western major brand. I'm sorry, I don't smoke, but that at the time sort of really, it helped with, you know, certain things, and this is just sort of it wouldn't work, you know, it would be completely stupid to do this today. It has lost its meaning, but at that time, it sort of stood out as a special sort of Western gift of tobacco. Yeah. Any other questions about tobacco or China or anything else? Yes.
What was smoking the pipe? Was it also competitive to cigarettes and cigars, or?
So here we get again to this urban-rural distinction. So it is absolutely the case that smoking the long pipe remained a very important smoking habit, even you know, until after 1945 in the countryside. And I should say that a lot of people never made that transition to cigarettes. With cigars, to my knowledge, that has not caught on in China in the urban, among the urban society, as much as cigarettes, and then, you know, the longer cigarettes for ladies, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that certainly remained a parallel market. And I think in some ways it's an example of a product that develops and maintains certain trends that replicate and intensify urban and rural preferences and tastes. I think one thing I wanted to say is that there were women who smoked in the urban context, not directly out on the street though. Whereas if you were an old lady, a grandmother in a family, and at the head, you were allowed to smoke the pipe. And so we actually do have images of more, you know, really elderly grandmas who smoke with tobacco with a pipe. But that's only if you are old and you've made it to the top of the family's hierarchy. So, you know, nobody can tell you what you do, then you can smoke. Yes, please.
I'd be interested to know if they grew the tobacco in China and sold it in China, what did BAT contribute? What was their expertise that set them apart from?
Oh, from other. So BAT basically it ran the whole organization in terms of production management in Shanghai, setting up the distribution system, and forcefully trying to expand the distributors' network across the country. I think BAT was really successful here. By the mid-1920s, BAT had 19 provincial headquarters and about 250 sub-provincial offices. And now to your question, what did BAT contribute here? I think it contributed, apart from the production, the advertising materials, and made sort of big efforts to not let the brand like Ruby Queen to become too fragmented in different parts of the country. Now, I think this is something where you can say that Canaday is almost more an observer and a supervisor than an actual salesperson. And I think that in terms of any advertising, particular advertising techniques or skills and practices that he brought with him from his work in the US, I don't think that they were really applicable. And I think your question goes to this issue that over time BAT really noticed that it didn't increase sales and made the brands more popular by sending more foreigners into these offices and fields. And we see the trend of the light management through the Western sales agent. And they are basically, by the mid-1930s, they are almost phased out. And I think this is an evidence of that the company realized that the contribution on that aspect was not that decisive. Yes, please.
What happened to the Mr. Connolly after the 1926?
Yeah. We'll discuss this next football game. No. So Mr. Canaday went off. He went back to the States for a while, and then he went to Australia. He still was very, entrepreneurial, and he got married in Australia to an artist and then came back. He is a person in many ways who never really sort of found the one thing that kept him professionally in one place. And it's really quite amazing if you are interested in other parts of his life. The University of Toledo has his US years and his archives on that part. So in many ways, he did not become a superstar in advertising. He dabbled in various businesses. But on the other hand, he was, he maintained a sort of a life of somebody who always was seeking a new challenge and wanted to see new places and societies. And he, in many ways, kept true to himself that he never completely neglected his artistic interests. So that's what I can tell you. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.